The first time it happened, Clara thought it was just the cold getting to him. The ground was frozen, the wind sharp, and nothing about that December morning felt right. But when she stepped outside the cabin before sunrise, she found their old chestnut gelding, Buck, standing in the far corner of the corral, one hoof scraping steadily at the dirt near the fence. His breath steamed in the pale light. She called to him, but he didn't budge, just kept pawing, rhythmic, focused. It took her a moment to realize it wasn't aggression or restlessness. It was purpose. That night she told her husband, Eli, but he just shrugged it off. He's an old trail horse. Maybe he smells a root or a snake nest. But it wasn't a one-time thing. The next morning, the same hoof, same spot. She watched from the porch this time, arms wrapped tight around her shawl. Buck walked straight to it, like something was calling him. Clara didn't say anything that night. She just watched Eli as he whittled by the fire, the curl of cedar shavings gathering at his boots. Something about it needled her. How easily men dismissed things women and animals noticed. On the third morning, Clara brought a shovel. Buck had already started, and when he stepped aside, she took over, digging where his hoof had stirred the frost-bitten earth. It was harder than it looked. The soil clung stubborn and frozen, but about a foot down, the metal edge of the shovel hit something. A dull clink. She dropped to her knees, brushed with her gloves. A wooden box, cracked at the seams and damp from years below. She pulled it out, hands trembling, and opened it right there in the cold. Inside, wrapped in rotted linen, was a silver ring, thin but elegant, set with a single stone dulled by time. Beneath it, a scrap of parchment, barely legible. For the one who waits. Clara sat back on her heels, stunned. The horse stood beside her, silent now, ears forward. She turned the ring in her hand, felt the weight of something long buried. Not just metal, but memory. It didn't belong to them, not to this ranch, not to Buck, but he'd found it all the same. That evening, she showed Eli. He stared at it long, then said only, "That was never in the deed records." They both knew what that meant. Someone once stood here, loved here, lost here. Clara placed the ring on the mantel, but Buck kept digging every morning. And now, she started to wonder. What else did he remember that they didn't? By the fourth morning, Buck's hoof marks had widened the circle where the earth no longer froze. Clara found herself waking before dawn, waiting at the window, coffee untouched in her hands, just to watch him do it again. She didn't stop him. Not anymore. Eli had taken the box inside, carefully wrapping the ring and note, but he said little. Clara noticed the way he looked at Buck now, not with irritation, but with a wary sort of respect. Like the old horse knew something they didn't. That afternoon, Clara rode into town under the excuse of needing salt and sewing needles, but what she really wanted was a visit with Mrs. Granger, the town's unofficial historian and widow of 3 decades. Her memory was sharp, her tongue sharper, and her parlor always smelled like peppermint. Clara placed the box on her lap, careful not to mention how it was found. "Did you ever hear of anyone losing something like this?" Mrs. Granger narrowed her eyes, turned the ring over in her fingers, then gasped so softly Clara almost missed it. "This looks just like Hattie McCrae's wedding band," she whispered. "She was engaged to a ranch hand from out east. Jameson, I think. Disappeared before the wedding. Folks said he ran off, but Hattie always claimed he was buried somewhere near her family land." Clara leaned forward. "Where was that?" The old woman pointed. "Your property, child. The McCrae homestead. You live on it now." The words settled over Clara like snow on a roof. Soft, silent, and heavy. She left town with more than supplies. She left with Hattie's story tucked between her ribs. When she returned, Buck was at it again. This time he'd unearthed something else. A small, rusted clasp, like from a locket. She picked it up with trembling fingers. Eli watched her from the porch, arms folded. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said as she climbed the steps. "I think I have," Clara whispered. That night, she couldn't sleep. The fire popped softly, and the shadows moved like memories along the walls. She stared at the ring on the mantel, then turned to Eli. "What if Buck's not just digging at the ground? What if he's digging at something left behind?" Eli looked into the flames. "Then we better start paying attention." Outside, snow began to fall again, covering everything in white. But not the patch where Buck dug. That stayed bare, exposed, like the earth itself refused to forget. The next morning, Clara walked out before Buck. She stood at the edge of the digging site, her boots crunching over frost, and waited. The horse joined her minutes later, quiet as snowfall, and began pawing at the ground without even glancing her way. She knelt beside him, brushing her hand across the loose dirt, as if listening to the land itself. That afternoon, she didn't sew or sweep or bake. Instead, she opened the old deed papers Eli kept in a drawer no one touched. And there it was, tucked in a corner beneath the newer filings, the McCrae name, scrawled in faded ink, dated 1862. The land had changed hands after that, shuffled between cattlemen and speculators, but no record ever mentioned a grave. Clara read through the names, looking for one that might belong to Jameson, the fiancé who never married. Nothing. As dusk approached, she saddled Buck and rode the fence line, her eyes scanning for any place where the land curved unnaturally. Near the stream, she found it, a dip in the earth, shaped too clean, too deliberate. No marker, no stone, just a low patch of grass that refused to grow even in spring. She dismounted and stood over it, heart thudding. Buck stayed back, as if waiting. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about Hattie McCrae, about the woman who might have wandered the same woods, aching to know where her love had gone, about how love like that doesn't vanish. It lingers, somewhere deep beneath the surface, waiting to be found. "I think she's still here," Clara whispered to Eli over dinner. "Not alive, but her longing, her question, it's never been answered." Eli looked at her across the table, eyes shadowed but soft. "And Buck's trying to answer it?" "Maybe not trying," she said. "Maybe he already knows." They sat in silence as the fire dimmed. Later, as Clara lay in bed with sleep refusing to come, she heard something. Soft hoofbeats outside the window. She pulled on her coat and stepped out into the night. Buck was at the edge of the clearing again, scraping gently. Clara walked to him and put a hand on his neck. "You're not just a horse, are you?" she said, half smiling. Buck blinked slow, steady, and stopped digging for once. Instead, he stood beside her, still as the grave beneath their feet. The wind stirred gently, brushing the grass like fingers through hair. Something was waking. Or maybe something was finally being seen. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the land was trying to speak, and Buck was its voice. The next day, while Eli was tending the livestock, Clara searched the cabin, not knowing what she was looking for until she found it. Under the warped floorboard near the hearth, tucked beneath layers of soot and time, was a folded paper sealed with wax so brittle it cracked at her touch. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, revealing faded ink and careful penmanship. The letter was addressed to Miss Hattie McCrae and signed by Thomas Jameson. It was dated just 2 days before the man supposedly vanished. "My dearest," it began, "I have returned earlier than expected. I will come to you by moonlight, though your father forbade it. I cannot wait another day to call you mine. If I am late, It is only because I must fetch something from the old cottonwood grove, the place where you first kissed me." Clara's breath hitched. The cottonwood grove still stood near the ridge. She had ridden past it many times, never imagining it once cradled a love so desperate it defied a father's wrath. She reread the letter twice, then showed Eli. He studied it in silence, then looked toward the window. "We should dig there," he said quietly. "At the grove." They waited until the snow softened. The next morning, just as Buck resumed his ritual digging near the fence, Clara and Eli led him toward the cottonwoods. He didn't resist. In fact, the old horse moved like he knew the way by heart. The grove was quiet, shadowed, but peaceful. Clara paced in circles, letting her feet tell her where to stop. Finally, a small clearing between two trees made her pause. Buck lowered his head, nosing the dirt. Eli began to dig. They didn't have to go far. A few feet down, they unearthed rotted cloth and something harder. Bone. Time had stripped it bare, but the buttons of a wool coat still clung stubbornly to the rib cage. A rusted locket lay nearby, broken open to reveal the faded portrait of a young woman with dark curls and shy eyes. Hattie. Clara knelt, heart aching. "He never left her," she whispered. "He was coming back." Buck let out a low, mournful sound, and Clara reached up to stroke his mane. "You remembered," she said softly. Eli nodded, removing his hat. "We'll bury him proper." And they did, right there between the cottonwoods, with stones to mark the place. As the wind passed through the trees like a hymn, Clara finally felt the land breathe easy. Something lost had been found, and something broken had begun to mend. The morning after the burial, Clara woke to the smell of smoke, not fire, but memory, the kind that clings to old wood and colder dreams. She stepped out into the crisp air, eyes tracing the curve of the land that now bore a new grave, and a name no longer forgotten. Buck stood beside the cottonwoods, still, watchful, as though keeping vigil. Back inside, Clara began clearing the hearth, wanting to make room for warmth. As she removed the ashes and old soot, something clinked in the grate. She paused, brushing gently until the edge of a small metal frame surfaced. Lifting it carefully, she found a scorched but intact photograph. Sepia-toned, the corners curled with time. A young couple stood together, stiff in posture, but soft in expression. The man, unmistakably Thomas Jameson, stood in a wool coat, his arm resting lightly around a woman with cascading dark curls. Hattie McCrae. Clara sat for a long while with the photo in her lap, soot on her hands, tears in her eyes. It was one thing to hear a story. It was another to hold proof of love that once dared to bloom beneath silence and snow. When Eli returned, she showed him the photo. He took it with reverence, nodding slowly. "They were real," she said. "All of it." Eli gave a quiet smile. "They still are." That afternoon, they rode into town together. Clara approached the church with the photo and letter. She told the pastor the truth. Not the town's version, but the one that had risen from the earth itself. He listened, somber and still, then promised a proper blessing for Thomas's grave. Word spread. Hattie's name began to surface in conversations with less scorn, more curiosity. The story, once buried beneath years and rumor, started to change shape. That evening, Clara placed the photograph on the mantel beside the ring and locket. Together, they told a story no longer silent. Buck lay outside the cabin, his old bones settled near the spot he'd dug for days. Clara brought him a blanket, laying it over his broad back. "You brought him home," she whispered. "You did what none of us could." The horse let out a soft breath, his eyes closing. Inside, the fire crackled. Eli took Clara's hand, the light catching the edges of her smile, one born not just from peace, but purpose. The cabin, once quiet with grief, now hummed with something steadier. Memory, love, and the truth finally spoken aloud. Outside, the snow fell gently, but it no longer felt cold. Not where hearts had been warmed by what was found. That night, as the snow tapped soft against the windows, Clara couldn't sleep. She rose quietly, leaving Eli snoring gently in the bed they now shared, and padded barefoot to the hearth. The fire had faded to glowing embers, casting flickering shadows across the room. She sat down, drawing the photo closer, and picked up the small tin box where she'd stored the locket and letter. As her fingers brushed the edge of the photo, something else inside shifted. A small circular shape rolled to the floor with a dull clink. Clara gasped. The ring. Not just a ring, but the ring, a delicate gold band, dusty and dull but still intact, with a small sapphire nestled in the center. She picked it up reverently, her breath caught. On the inside of the band, faintly etched, were the letters T and H. Thomas and Hattie. They never even got to say their vows, she whispered. She held the ring over the embers for a moment, watching its surface catch the glow. Then she slipped it onto her finger. Not to claim it, but to carry it, just for the moment, as a tether between the living and the lost. The door creaked open behind her. Eli stepped out, rubbing his eyes. Couldn't sleep either. She turned, showing him the ring. His expression softened. Where was it? Inside the frame, she said. Hidden, maybe waiting. He knelt beside her, examining the ring. We should bury it with him, he said gently. It was meant for her. Clara hesitated. I thought so too. But what if it's meant to stay here, as a reminder? Eli nodded slowly. Then we keep it safe, like the story. The next day, Clara took the ring into town. She had it cleaned, polished. The jeweler, an old man with careful hands, handled it like a relic. Where'd you find this? He asked. Buried in the ashes, she replied, with a promise no one kept. He didn't ask further. When she returned, she placed the ring on a small velvet cloth atop the mantel. It shimmered in the light, a quiet symbol of all that had been lost and reclaimed. Buck stood near the cottonwoods again, eyes on the trees, as if watching for someone. Clara joined him, resting her hand on his shoulder. They were real, she said again. And now, they're remembered. The horse dipped his head. Somewhere in the hush of pine and wind, it felt like the land itself was grateful. And Clara, standing in the snow beside the grave of a forgotten love, finally understood. Some stories aren't meant to be rewritten, just recovered. One ring, one letter, one heart at a time. The morning broke with a softness Clara hadn't seen in weeks. The snow, once thick and unrelenting, had begun to melt in slow rivulets along the cabin roof, dripping into the soil like tears finally released. She stood on the porch, wrapped in Eli's coat, watching as Buck pawed gently at the softened earth, his ritual done, his purpose seemingly fulfilled. For the first time since she'd arrived, there was no urgency in the air. No digging, no whispers from the past, just the quiet hum of peace. Inside, Clara gathered the letter, the ring, the cleaned photograph, and placed them all inside a wooden box Eli had carved long ago. She nestled a scrap of Hattie's old shawl inside as well, found beneath a floorboard days before. You're building a memory box? Eli asked, stepping in from chopping wood. I'm building a resting place, she said, for everything that never got one. That afternoon, they returned to the grave beneath the cottonwoods. Buck followed, not leading this time, but joining, a companion now, not a guide. Clara dug a small space beside the headstone and laid the box inside with reverent care. She said no words. Neither did Eli. It didn't feel like a funeral. It felt like a reunion. That evening, the cabin filled with light. Not just firelight, but the kind of glow that comes from knowing you've done right by those who came before. Clara cooked stew, humming a tune she didn't know she remembered, and Eli whittled quietly by the window. Buck lay curled near the doorway, his breath slow and steady. As dusk faded, Clara found herself staring out into the trees, wondering about Hattie, what her laugh sounded like, how she walked, whether she liked the way Thomas wore his collar. "She'd have been happy," Clara whispered. Eli looked up. "You think she's watching?" "I think she was waiting," Clara replied, "and now she's resting." That night, a soft wind moved through the trees, brushing past the cottonwoods like fingers through old hair, and in that quiet, Eli took Clara's hand in his, their palms warm against the chill. There was no more snow in the forecast. The land had given up its secrets. The silence had spoken. And for the first time since the digging began, Buck did not rise at dawn. He simply slept, peaceful, unmoving, as if he too had laid something to rest. And outside, beneath the earth and the weight of long-forgotten sorrow, love lay quiet, and finally whole. 3 days passed without a single sign from Buck. He no longer pawed at the ground. He simply stayed close to the porch, content as if a burden had lifted. Clara found herself wondering what filled her now that the mystery had gone quiet. She swept the floor, tidied the shelves, read from an old journal she'd once tucked away, but none of it stirred her the way the grave and its ghost had. Then, on the 4th morning, a knock came at the door. Not heavy, not rushed, just steady. Clara and Eli looked at one another. Few folks ventured out this far, especially in winter. Eli opened the door slowly. A man stood there, older, thin, wrapped in a long coat dusted with snow. His face was worn but kind, and in his arms he held a satchel. "I'm looking for the woman who found the McCrae ring," he said. Clara stepped forward, surprised. "That was me." The man nodded. "Name's Albert McCrae. My great-aunt was Hattie. Word made its way through town. Took some digging to find the truth, but here I am." He opened the satchel and pulled out an old family Bible, its spine nearly split. Inside, he showed her a name, Thomas McCrae, with Hattie LeClaire penciled just beside it, unwed but marked betrothed. "My grandmother told me stories when I was young," he said, voice soft. "But we thought Hattie vanished. Some said she ran off. Others said Thomas died and she went mad. We never had answers." Clara led him to the mantel, where the ring now sat in a glass jar beside the faded photo. "She didn't run," Clara said. "She waited. And now she's found." Albert's eyes misted. "My family's had more land disputes and broken hearts than we can count. But this put something back together." He asked if he could visit the grave. Clara and Eli took him out to the cottonwoods, where the earth had settled, the snow melted clean around it. Albert knelt, touched the soil gently, then placed a folded cloth beside the grave. "She liked blue," he said, "so I brought her ribbon." That evening, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that some great circle had closed. She looked at Buck, still lying peacefully beneath the eaves, and whispered, "You brought him here too, didn't you?" Buck lifted his head just enough to blink slowly, then rested again. In the cabin, the wind eased, The fire crackled low. And for the first time, Clara felt the story she'd unearthed no longer pulling her forward, but settling, as if saying, "Now, rest. There's nothing more you need to carry." The following morning, Clara sat at the table with a blank page before her and an inkwell untouched. For hours, she simply stared. Not at the paper, but through it, into the shape of a life that hadn't been hers, but somehow felt like it was. The snow had melted completely now, leaving behind a thawed field and footprints that no longer marked just her own. She dipped the pen and began to write. Not a journal entry, not a note for Eli, but a letter to Hattie McCrae. "Dear Hattie, you were never lost. You were just waiting to be heard." She paused, letting the words come slowly, carefully. "I don't know your favorite song, or the sound of your laugh, but I know the shape of your grief. I felt it in the way the wind moved around your name. I saw it in the digging hooves of a horse that could not speak, but never stopped trying." She continued until the page was full, filled with a stranger's gratitude for a love that had outlived war, silence, and time. When she finished, she folded the letter and pressed it between the pages of the family Bible Albert had given her the day before. "It belongs with the story," she told Eli. That afternoon, Buck rose on his own for the first time in days. Clara followed him, not with urgency, but with understanding. He walked past the cabin, down to the fence line, and stopped where the old oak tree stood. There, buried beneath the frost-softened soil, lay an old tin box Clara had never seen before. Buck pawed once, then stepped back. Clara knelt, unearthed it gently, and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a folded dress ribbon, brittle with age, and a small brass locket. She clicked it open. Inside was a daguerreotype, Hattie's face on one side, Thomas on the other. Both faded, both staring forward, still bound by something that death had failed to quiet. That night, she placed the box on the mantel beside the ring and photograph, forming a kind of shrine not to sorrow, but to remembrance. "They found each other again," Eli said, voice low. Clara nodded. "And maybe," she added, "they helped me find something too." She looked at the man across from her, the one who had never pressed, never questioned, just stood quietly beside her in the snow. In his silence, she had heard trust. In his patience, she had been allowed to heal. And in the light of the fire, something new had begun to grow. Not haunted, not hurried. Just whole. Just hers. Winter gave way to the hush of spring, and Clara moved through the cabin with a quiet rhythm that no longer echoed loss, but something gentler, like memory folded into daily life. Buck still slept near the porch, his old bones creaking less with each warming day. Eli split wood in the mornings, his presence constant, unspoken and reliable, and the ring, Hattie's ring, stayed nestled in its little glass jar, untouched, yet no longer forgotten. On the morning the last frost melted, Clara lit the hearth for the final cold snap of the season. As the fire flickered, she glanced down at the stone base, and something curious caught her eye. A crack, thin and deliberate, as if once sealed by a hand long gone. She knelt beside it, brushing away the dust, and eased her fingers into the gap. Beneath the hearthstone lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, aged but intact. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside were two things: a faded journal with a worn leather cover, and a letter, never sent, addressed in delicate ink. "To my beloved should he return." Her breath caught. The journal's first page read, Hattie McCrae, 1864. Clara read for hours, the sun shifting across the table. The pages were filled with longing, fear, small joys, and finally, resolve. In the last entry, Hattie had written, "If no one comes, I'll remain. I'll guard what's left, even if it's only soil and silence. But if someone finds this, please know I was loved once. And I stayed because love doesn't always get to leave." That evening, Clara didn't speak much. She simply handed the journal to Eli, who read beside her in long pauses, his jaw clenched more than once. When he finished, he closed the cover and said softly, "You gave her peace." Clara shook her head. "Buck did." Eli smiled faintly. "Maybe, but you listened." Later, as dusk leaned into night, Clara stepped out onto the porch. She wore the locket now, not around her neck, but tied to a thin leather string in her pocket. Close, but not showy. She stood beside Buck, who watched the stars come out like he'd been waiting for them. "You knew," she whispered to him, "all this time." Buck lifted his head one last time, pressed it gently to her leg, and settled back into the porch shadows. And when morning came, Clara didn't wake to find him by the door. Instead, she found quiet, stillness, and the knowing that some spirits only stay as long as they're needed. The ring still sat on the mantel, but now it meant something more. It wasn't just a symbol of what was buried. It was proof of what had endured.